He was born with the blood of Caesars and kings flowing through his veins, destined to rule empires. Yet he died in a rented room, a divorced outcast with nothing but a broken heart. He created his own nobility, built a shadow court of make-believe dukes, and sacrificed his own family for a crown that didn't exist. His name was Archduke Karl Pius. How did a man who was willing to sell his soul for a throne end up ruling nothing but a kingdom of smoke? That collision was inevitable. Karl Pius was crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled: the gilded imperial dream he was born into and the brutal modern reality he was forced to survive. Vienna, 1909, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. To the outside observer, this city was the pinnacle of civilization. It was the home of Freud, of Klimt, of Mahler. It was a city where the coffee houses buzzed with revolutionary ideas, but the palaces remained locked in a medieval dream. In the winter of that year, on December 4th, a child was born in the Palais Toscana. The Palais Toscana was not just a home, it was a fortress of protocol. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax, incense, and old velvet. It was here that Karl Pius Maria Adelgonda Blanca Leopold Ignaz Raphael Mikkel Salvator, to give him his full crushing weight of names, took his first breath. He was the youngest son of Archduke Leopold Salvator and Infanta Blanca of Spain, and to understand the chaotic fire that would burn within Karl Pius later in life, you simply have to look at his parents. They were the tectonic plates that would grind together to form his personality. His father, Leopold Salvator, was a Habsburg contradiction. He was a prince of Tuscany, yes, but he was also a modern man trapped in an ancient uniform. He was an inspector general of artillery, but his heart wasn't in the parade ground. It was in the laboratory. Leopold was an inventor. He patented designs for trucks, for all-wheel drive vehicles. He was fascinated by mechanics, by how things worked. He was a man of logic, of science, of quiet pragmatism. His mother, Infanta Blanca, was the storm. She was a Bourbon. And not just any Bourbon. She was the daughter of Carlos, Duke of Madrid. She was the daughter of the Carlist pretender. In her veins flowed the blood of the men who had plunged Spain into 3 civil wars because they refused to compromise their principles. Blanca was a woman of iron will, deep Catholicism, and a ferocious pride in her Spanish heritage. While Leopold tinkered with engines, Blanca dreamed of thrones. Karl Pius was the baby of this massive brood. Being the youngest of 10 children in a royal household is a peculiar destiny. You are loved, certainly, but you are also irrelevant. The dynastic pressure is on the eldest, on the heirs. The youngest is the spare of the spare. Little Karl grew up in a world of stifling luxury. The nursery was run with military precision. The children spoke German to their father, French to the diplomats, and Spanish to their mother. Always Spanish. Blanca ensured that even in the snows of Vienna, her children knew they belonged to the sun-baked soil of Castile. Imagine the psychological landscape of this boy. He is told he is special. He is told he is chosen by God to rule. Servants bow when he enters the room. He never opens a door for himself. He never pours his own water. He learns that the world is a hierarchy, and he is at the top. But outside the velvet curtains of the Palais Toscana, the foundations of the world were cracking. Karl was 4 years old when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. He was too young to understand the politics, but he would have felt the shift in the atmosphere, the whispered conversations between his parents, the sudden absence of the footmen who were drafted into the army, the way his father, Leopold, donned his general's uniform and looked graver every day. The Great War began as a parade. It ended as a slaughterhouse. For the first few years of his conscious life, Karl Pius knew only war. But for the Habsburgs in Vienna, the war was a distant thunder until 1916. In 1916, the old emperor, Franz Joseph, died. He had ruled for 68 years. He was the glue holding the empire together. When he died, the symbol of stability vanished. His successor, the young Emperor Karl, tried desperately to hold the pieces together, but the rot had set in. By 1918, the war was lost. And this is where the trauma of Karl Pius truly begins. There is a specific kind of fear that grips an aristocracy when the people turn against them. It is the fear of 1789, the fear of the guillotine. In late 1918, Vienna was starving. The blockade had choked the life out of the city. People were eating sawdust mixed with flour, and they looked at the palaces, at the home of our young Karl Pius, not with awe, but with hunger. Archduke Leopold Salvator was a smart man. He saw the writing on the wall. The socialist currents were rising. The monarchy was not just losing a war, it was losing its right to exist. For a 9-year-old boy, the collapse of an empire isn't a political event. It's a domestic earthquake. It's the sight of his mother crying while packing jewelry into hidden linings of coats. It's the confusion of seeing his father, the general, stripped of his command. On November 11, 1918, the Emperor Karl renounced his participation in the administration of the state. The empire was dead. The Republic of Austria was born, and the new republic had one priority: the destruction of the Habsburgs. In April 1919, the Austrian government passed the Habsburg Law. It was brutal in its simplicity. It banished all members of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine from Austrian territory unless they renounced their dynastic rights and accepted the status of private citizens. Furthermore, it confiscated their property. Karl Pius stood in the hallway of the Palais Toscana. He watched as men from the new government came in with clipboards. They inventoried the paintings. They counted the silver. They claimed the very bed he slept in as property of the state. Infanta Blanca was furious. She was a Bourbon. She believed in the divine right of kings. To her, this was not legislation. It was theft. It was sacrilege. She refused to let her husband renounce his rights. They would not bow to a republic of shopkeepers and traders. So they chose exile. The departure was hasty and humiliating. They could take only what they could carry. The vast estates, the hunting lodges, the investments, gone. Overnight, one of the wealthiest families in Europe became destitute. Karl Pius sat by the window of the train as it crossed the border into Italy. He watched the mountains of his homeland recede. He didn't know it then, but he was leaving his childhood behind. He was crossing a threshold from which there was no return. He was no longer an archduke of a reigning house. He was a piece of driftwood in the wreckage of Europe. But something interesting happened on that train ride, something that would define the rest of his life. As Austria vanished, his mother, Blanca, turned his gaze elsewhere. She told him, "We have lost Austria, but we still have Spain." The seeds of the Prince of Nowhere were planted in that carriage. If he could not be a Habsburg in Vienna, perhaps he could be a Bourbon in Madrid. But Spain was not a sanctuary. Spain was a volcano waiting to erupt. The family settled first in Italy in Viareggio. They rented a villa. It sounds romantic, a villa in Italy, but the reality was stark. They had no income. Leopold Salvator, the great inventor, the general, tried to sell his patents, but the post-war economy was shattered. Nobody was buying. The family had to sell their jewelry to buy food. The archdukes and archduchesses, who had been dressed in silk, were now wearing mended clothes. This period from 1919 to the mid-1920s was the crucible for Karl Pius. He watched his father, a man of dignity, crumble under the weight of irrelevance. Leopold missed the structure of the army. He missed his laboratory. He aged rapidly, his eyes losing their spark. But Karl grew hard. Poverty affects people differently. For some, it breaks their spirit. For Karl, it fueled a deep burning resentment. He saw the injustice of it. Why should they, the blood of emperors, struggle to pay the grocer? He began to despise the new democratic order of Europe. He saw democracy as the system that had stolen his birthright. He was growing up in the shadow of Italian fascism. He saw Mussolini's black shirts marching in the streets. And unlike the liberals who were horrified, the teenage Karl saw something else. He saw order. He saw strength. He saw men who didn't apologize for power. While his older brothers, Leopold and Anton, drifted into the aimless life of the displaced aristocracy, playing tennis, attending endless tea parties with other exiles, Karl was reading. He was listening to the intense, fiery debates of the Carlist exiles who visited his mother. These men spoke of a pure Spain, a Spain untainted by liberalism, a Spain where the king was the father of the nation, answerable only to God. They told stories of his grandfather, Carlos VII, the warrior king who rode a white horse into battle, to a boy who felt powerless. These stories were intoxicating. They offered a narrative where he wasn't a victim, but a sleeping hero. In 1926, the family made a pivotal decision. Italy was too expensive, and their hearts lay further west. They moved to Barcelona, the city of anarchists and artists. When Karl Pius arrived there at the age of 17, he stepped into the most politically volatile city on earth. Here the family was closer to the Carlist heartland. His mother, Infanta Blanca, was treated with reverence by the Carlist minority. They called her Doña Blanca. They kissed her hand. For the first time since leaving Vienna, Karl felt the warm glow of recognition, but he also saw the enemy. Barcelona was a battlefield of ideologies. The anarchists controlled the streets. The hostility toward the monarchy and the church was palpable. Karl Pius didn't retreat into a royal bubble. He went to university. This is a crucial detail that sets him apart. He didn't just get a tutor. He enrolled at the University of Barcelona to study industrial engineering. He followed in his father's intellectual footsteps, but in a much rougher environment. Imagine the young Archduke sitting in a lecture hall surrounded by students who were plotting revolution. He kept his head down, but his eyes were open. He was learning how the modern world worked, not the world of court etiquette, but the world of machines, production, and brute force. He was becoming a man of two worlds. By day, an engineering student dealing with the realities of the 20th century. By night, a prince of the blood, soaking in the medieval dreams of his mother's Carlist court. But as the 1920s bled into the 1930s, the time for studying was ending. The time for choosing sides was beginning. In 1931, the Spanish monarchy fell. King Alfonso XIII fled. The Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed. Churches were burned. The Red Terror was a whisper that was becoming a scream. For Karl Pius, this wasn't just politics. It was a threat to his very existence. And he decided he wasn't going to run away again. If the world wanted a fight, he would give them one. But he wouldn't fight in Spain, not yet. His first battlefield would be the land of his birth. Austria was calling him back, but not the Austria of waltzes, the Austria of street brawls. The young Archduke was about to trade his slide rule for a rifle. By the early 1930s, Europe was no longer walking toward the abyss. It was running. The polite diplomacy of the 19th century had been strangled in the trenches of the Great War. Now politics was not debated in parliaments. It was fought with brass knuckles and lead pipes in the back alleys of Berlin, Madrid, and Vienna. For Archduke Karl Pius, the time for studying engineering was over. The slide rule could measure the world, but it couldn't save it. He had grown up watching his father, the gentle inventor, lose everything because he followed the rules. Karl determined he would not make the same mistake. He returned to the land of his birth, Austria. But he did not come as a prince. He came as a soldier in a war that had no front lines. Austria in the 1930s was a broken state. The socialists controlled Red Vienna, building massive housing projects and dreaming of a workers' paradise. The conservatives, terrified of a Bolshevik revolution, retreated to the countryside and formed militias. They called themselves the Heimwehr, the Home Guard. To modernize, the Heimwehr looks uncomfortably like the Nazis. They were anti-democratic, anti-socialist, and authoritarian, but there was a key difference. They were Austrian patriots. They hated the Nazis, who wanted to swallow Austria into Germany. The Heimwehr wanted an independent Catholic corporate state, and in their ranks, marching shoulder to shoulder with farmers and shopkeepers, was the 23-year-old Archduke Karl Pius. This is a moment of profound transformation. Picture the scene. Here is the grandson of the Carlist king, the great-nephew of emperors, standing guard on a street corner in a dusty Austrian town. He is not commanding a legion from a horse. He is taking orders from a local militia leader. He threw himself into the Heimwehr with a fanaticism that surprised his family. He participated in the street battles against the socialists. He learned the brutal language of violence. He learned that legitimacy didn't come from a crown. It came from who held the square at the end of the day. In February 1934, the tensions exploded into a brief but bloody civil war. The Austrian army and the Heimwehr crushed the socialists. Karl saw the artillery firing on worker housing complexes in Vienna. He saw the bodies in the streets. Most royals are shielded from such visceral horror. They view war from the balcony. Karl Pius viewed it from the gutter. This experience calcified his soul. It stripped away any romantic notions he had about chivalry. He realized that to restore the old world, you had to be willing to use the ruthless methods of the new one. But while Karl was fighting in the streets of Austria, a different clock was ticking in Spain, a clock that was counting down to his destiny. While Karl Pius was brawling in Vienna, the Carlist movement in Spain was facing an existential crisis. Their king, the man they called Alfonso Carlos I, was 80 years old. Alfonso Carlos was a relic. He had fought in the Carlist wars of the 1870s. He was the last male descendant of the Carlist line, and he had no children. For the Carlist faithful, the requete, this was a nightmare. Their entire ideology was based on legitimacy. God chose the king by blood. You couldn't just vote for a new one. If the bloodline ended, the movement ended. The old man knew the end was near. He looked around his family for an heir. The strict Carlist laws, the Salic law, forbade women from inheriting. But if all the men were dead, could the claim pass through a woman to her sons? This was the loophole, the semi-Salic interpretation. Alfonso Carlos had a niece. Her name was Blanca, the mother of Karl Pius. In the salons of Vienna and the exile courts, the whispering began. Blanca had 4 sons, Leopold the eldest, Anton, Franz Joseph, and Karl Pius the youngest. By right of age, Leopold should have been the heir, but the 1930s were a messy time for romance. Leopold had fallen in love with a divorced American woman. In the eyes of the ultra-Catholic Carlists, this was an abomination. He was pressured to renounce his rights. Then there was Anton. He married a sister of the King of Romania. A good match, but he seemed uninterested in the thorny politics of Spain. That left the younger ones, Franz Joseph and Karl Pius. Karl Pius watched his brothers hesitate. He saw them prioritize their personal lives, their comfort, or their confusion. He felt a rising disgust. To him, the crown of Spain was not a burden to be dodged. It was a sacred duty to be seized. Then, tragedy struck. September 29, 1936, Vienna. The old pretender, Alfonso Carlos, was crossing the street. He was struck by a military truck. He died the next day. It was a clumsy, undignified end to a dynasty that had shaped Spanish history for a century. With his last breath, the male line of the Carlist kings was extinguished. The throne was empty. The Carlist movement was headless. And just 2 months prior, in July 1936, the Spanish Civil War had erupted. Spain was tearing itself apart. General Franco had launched his coup against the Republic. The country was divided into two zones, the nationalists and the Republicans. For the Carlists, this was not a political struggle. It was a crusade, a holy war. Thousands of Carlist volunteers, the requetés, donned their red berets and marched to the front lines. They died in droves, clutching rosaries and rifles, shouting, "Viva Cristo Rey!" Long live Christ the King. But who was their king? Before he died, Alfonso Carlos had appointed a regent, Xavier of Bourbon-Parma. Xavier was a good man, a decent man, but he was not a king. He was a placeholder, a caretaker manager for a movement that needed a messiah. Karl Pius, watching from the sidelines, saw the weakness. He saw Xavier hesitating, trying to play nice with General Franco. Karl knew that Franco was a shark. You didn't negotiate with sharks. You became a bigger shark. Karl Pius wanted to go to Spain. He wanted to lead the requeté himself. But there was a problem. Franco didn't want a charismatic royal prince on the front lines. A dead martyr was useful. A living rival was dangerous. The Francoist authorities kept the Habsburg Bourbon brothers at arm's length. So Karl Pius fought his war from the shadows. He began to build a network. He reached out to the most radical disaffected Carlists, the ones who felt Xavier was too soft. He wrote letters. He held secret meetings in Italy and Austria. He began to whisper a dangerous idea. The regent is weak. The blood of the true kings flows in me. He was assembling a shadow court. He was preparing to break the unity of the movement for the sake of saving it. But just as he was positioning himself as the savior of tradition, Karl Pius did something that would destroy his own argument. He fell in love. Her name was Krista Satzger de Balvanos. She was Hungarian. She was a countess. In any other story, she would be the perfect bride for a prince. But this was not a fairy tale. This was the House of Habsburg, and this was the rigid, unforgiving law of the Carlist succession. The law was clear. To inherit the claim, a prince must marry a princess of equal rank, a royal highness. Krista was noble, but she was not royal. In the brutal mathematics of dynasty, she was a commoner. If Karl married her, it would be a morganatic marriage. His wife would not be queen. His children would not be heirs. They would be cut off from the succession forever. Karl Pius knew this. He had seen his brother Leopold forced to renounce his rights for love. He knew the cost. This is the central mystery of Karl Pius's life. Here was a man driven by ambition, a man who wanted to be king more than anything else, a man who was plotting to overthrow a regent and claim a throne based on dynastic purity. And yet in May 1938, in the middle of his political maneuvering, he chose love. Why? Perhaps it was the arrogance of youth. Perhaps he thought, I am the king. I make the rules. Perhaps he thought he could force the Carlists to accept her. Or perhaps, deep down, He was still the frightened boy who lost his home in 1918, and he just wanted someone to hold on to in the dark. They married in Vienna. It was a glamorous wedding. But in the back rows, the Carlist diehards shook their heads. They saw the end before it had even begun. "He has cut his own throat," they whispered. Karl Pius walked out of that cathedral with a bride on his arm and a target on his back. He had just handed his enemies the ultimate weapon. How could he claim to be the guardian of tradition when he had just broken the most sacred law of his house? The year 1939 dawned. The Spanish Civil War ended. Franco was the victor. The dictator sat in Madrid, absolute master of Spain. The Carlists had won the war, but they had lost the peace. Franco forced them to merge with the fascists into a single party. He stripped them of their identity. The regent, Xavier, was sidelined. The movement was demoralized, fractured, and desperate. Karl Pius looked at the chaos and saw his opening. He believed that the rules of the past no longer applied. He believed that Spain needed a strong man, not a lawyer. He believed that his marriage didn't matter if he had the will to power. He was wrong, but he was about to drag thousands of people into his delusion. The stage was set for the great betrayal. The Prince of Nowhere was about to declare himself king of everything, but the crown he reached for was made of thorns, and the first blood it would draw would be his own. Time is a cruel architect. It builds empires with one hand and dismantles them with the other. By 1939, the architecture of Europe was collapsing. In September, the German Wehrmacht rolled into Poland. The Second World War had begun. The lights were going out all over the world, plunging the continent into a darkness that would last for 6 years. But while the great powers unleashed hell on the battlefield, a different kind of war was being fought in the shadows of neutral Spain. It was a war without tanks or airplanes. It was a war of whispers, of secret documents, and of ancient bloodlines. In Barcelona, Archduke Karl Pius was watching the world burn, and in the flames, he saw his destiny taking shape. To understand the rise of Karl Pius, you must first smell the air of Barcelona in 1940. It smelled of coal dust, unwashed bodies, and fear. History calls this period Los Años del Hambre, the years of hunger. The Spanish Civil War had ended, but it had left behind a carcass. The economy was shattered. Disease was rampant. The peace of General Franco was the peace of a prison yard. Karl Pius lived in this grim reality. He was no longer the wealthy Archduke of the Palais Toscana. He was a resident of a city on its knees. He walked these streets. He saw the desperation in the eyes of the men who had once been proud soldiers. But Karl saw something else in the misery. He saw opportunity. Desperate people look for saviors. They look for a return to a golden age. The grim reality of Franco's dictatorship, the rationing, the corruption, the police state, was beginning to disillusion even those who had fought for him. The Carlist faithful, the requete who had bled for God, fatherland, and king, were feeling betrayed. They had won the war, but they had not brought back the king. Instead, they had installed a generalissimo who treated the monarchy as a nuisance. Karl Pius sensed this resentment. He was an engineer by training. He understood pressure. He knew that if you compressed a gas enough, it would eventually explode. He decided to be the spark, but to become the king, he first had to eliminate the competition. Standing between Karl Pius and the throne was one man, Prince Xavier of Bourbon-Parma. Xavier was the appointed regent. He was the man the old King Alfonso Carlos had chosen to hold the fort until a true heir could be found. Xavier was a noble soul. He was brave. He would later be imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp for the French resistance. But in the cutthroat world of Spanish politics. Xavier had a fatal flaw. He was a foreigner. He was French. He spoke Spanish with an accent. He didn't understand the visceral, bloody passion of the Spanish street. Karl Pius began to exploit this. He started a whispering campaign. "Why are we following a Frenchman?" his agents would ask in the cafes and the barracks. "Why do we bow to a regent when we could have a king who lives among us, a king who speaks our language, a king with the blood of the Habsburgs?" Karl presented himself as the autochthonous choice, the Spanish Habsburg. He played up his mother's heritage. He played up his residence in Barcelona. He began to cultivate an image of vitality and strength that contrasted sharply with the distant intellectual image of Xavier. This was the beginning of the Carloctavista movement. He granted titles to the men who funded his lifestyle. To an outsider, it might have looked like a child playing dress-up, but Karl took it with deadly seriousness. He was building a state within a state. He was creating the trappings of power, hoping that the reality would follow. But as 1943 turned into 1944, the tide of the World War turned. The Axis powers were retreating. The Allies were advancing. Karl Pius had bet his political future on the idea of a totalitarian, anti-democratic Spain. But what would happen if democracy returned to Europe? What would happen if the fascists lost? Karl Pius was an astute observer. He realized that to survive, he couldn't just be the king of the past. He had to be the king of the future. He had to adapt. And so he began to make overtures to the very system he claimed to despise. He began to flirt with the idea of Catholic socialism. He began to sound less like a medieval warlord and more like a populist leader. He was a chameleon, changing his colors to match the shifting light of history. But a chameleon on a chessboard is still just a piece in someone else's game. Karl Pius thought he was the player. He thought he was moving the pieces. But he was about to discover that the board was rigged, and the opponent across the table, General Franco, had never intended to let him win. And deep in the heart of his shadow court, the cracks were already forming. His wife Krista was growing tired of the charade. The money was running low. The pressure was mounting. The Shadow King was sitting on a throne of glass. By 1944, the map of Europe was being redrawn in blood. The Third Reich was collapsing. The Allies were marching toward Berlin. The old dictators were dying one by one. But on the Iberian Peninsula, time had stopped. General Franco had turned Spain into a fortress. It was a hermit kingdom, isolated from the world, locked in a rigid, suffocating silence. In this silence, ghosts were allowed to roam, and the most ambitious ghost of all was Archduke Karl Pius, the man who called himself King Carlos VIII. He had issued his manifesto. He had claimed his crown. Now he had to build a kingdom out of nothing. This is the story of the Shadow Court, a surreal period where a penniless Austrian archduke played a high-stakes poker game with the shrewdest dictator of the 20th century. It was the peak of his power. It was the moment when the illusion was so perfect, so dazzling, that for a brief, shining moment, it almost became real. To understand the survival of Karl Pius, you have to understand the mind of Francisco Franco. Franco was not a monarchist. He was not a Democrat. He was a survivor. By 1945, with Hitler defeated, Franco was the last fascist standing. The world hated him. The United Nations ostracized him. He needed to secure his grip on power at home. His greatest internal threat came from the monarchists, specifically the supporters of Don Juan de Bourbon, the liberal heir to the throne, living in exile in Portugal. Don Juan was favored by the British. He represented a return to democracy. For Franco, Don Juan was dangerous. So Franco needed a weapon. He needed a counter-king. Enter Karl Pius. Franco's strategy was brilliant and cynical. He allowed Karl Pius to operate in Barcelona. He allowed the press to cover his activities. He allowed his ministers to meet with Karl's representatives. Why? Because every headline about Carlos VIII weakened the claim of Don Juan. If the monarchists were fighting each other, arguing about Salic law, about legitimacy, about history, they couldn't unite to overthrow Franco. Karl Pius knew he was being used. He wasn't stupid, but he made a calculated gamble. He believed he could outsmart the dictator. He thought, let him use me to weaken Don Juan. Once Don Juan is destroyed, I will be the only one left. Franco will have to choose me. It was a deal with the devil. Karl Pius traded his autonomy for oxygen. He became the tolerated king, the plan B of the regime. The result was a bizarre political twilight zone. In Madrid, the official government ignored him. But in Barcelona, the local authorities treated him like a visiting head of state. He had a secretariat. He had a council. He began to issue royal decrees. To the casual observer in Catalonia, it looked like the restoration had already happened. But the foundation of this power was not the love of the people. It was the temporary permission of a tyrant. If you are a king without a kingdom, how do you prove you exist? You exercise the most ancient prerogative of royalty. You create nobility. Between 1944 and 1951, Karl Pius embarked on a frenzy of ennoblement. He granted titles of duke, count, and marquis. He didn't just hand them out. He created an entire alternate aristocracy. Critics called it the Carnival Court. They sneered that he was selling titles to grocers and industrialists to pay his rent. And perhaps in some cases, money did change hands. The Archduke was broke. A king needs to eat. But look closer at the list of people he honored. It wasn't just about money, it was about building a tribe. He ennobled the martyrs of the Civil War. He ennobled the ideologues of the Carlist movement. He created the order of the prescribed legitimacy, a knighthood for the outcasts. By giving these men titles, he bought their loyalty forever. A man who buys a title is a customer. A man who receives a title for his suffering is a disciple. Karl Pius was building a cult of personality, binding these men to him with ribbons of silk and stars of enamel. For the recipients, these titles were real. They hung the certificates in their living rooms. They insisted on being addressed as Count or Baron. In the gray, drab reality of Franco's Spain, Karl Pius offered them a splash of color. He offered them dignity. He was the king of the forgotten, the king of the men who felt that history had passed them by. But while he was building this court of illusions, he had to shore up the legal cracks in his foundation. He had to deal with his brothers once and for all. The Pact of the Brothers was the legal bedrock of Karl's claim. But until 1947, it had been a private family agreement. Now, with the stakes rising, Karl needed it to be public. He needed it to be irrevocable. He needed his brothers to commit dynastic suicide in the eyes of the world. In 1947 and 1948, the final acts of renunciation were signed. Leopold, living in America, signed away his rights. He was done with Europe. He wanted a quiet life. Franz Joseph, the adventurer, signed away his rights. Anton, the Romanian exile, signed away his rights. It is a profound moment in the history of the House of Habsburg. 3 older brothers bowing their heads to the youngest. Why did they do it? Was it belief in Karl? Was it fear of the responsibility? Or was it simply exhaustion? They saw the throne of Spain not as a prize, but as a poisoned chalice. Let Karl drink from it, they might have thought. Let him be the one to break his heart. With these signatures, Karl Pius became, legally in the eyes of his faction, the sole heir. He was no longer a pretender. He was the head of the house. But this victory came at a terrible cost. It isolated him from the rest of the extended Habsburg family. The head of the main branch, Archduke Otto, looked at Karl's antics with disapproval. To the real Habsburgs in Vienna and Brussels, Karl Pius was becoming a rogue element, a jagged edge that needed to be smoothed over. He was cutting his ties to his past to secure his future. If Barcelona was his court, the mountains were his church. Karl Pius knew that his power base lay in the rural heartlands of Carlism, Navarre, the Basque Country, the Pyrenees. These were the places where the requete lived. These were the men who didn't care about diplomatic protocols or morganatic marriages. They cared about strength. Karl began to travel. He called them the voyages of the king. He went to Andorra. He trekked through the valleys. He met with the veterans of the Civil War in their farmhouses. He drank wine from their bodas. He spoke their dialect. This was his genius. Unlike Don Juan, who sat in a palace in Portugal drinking cocktails with diplomats, Karl Pius was here. He was touchable. He was flesh and blood. He cultivated the image of the guerrilla king, the king who slept on the ground, the king who was ready to lead a new crusade if the call came. Andorra became a strategic hub for him. It was a neutral ground where he could meet with supporters who were too afraid to come to Barcelona. It was here, in the thin mountain air, that the legend of Carlos VIII grew. They called him El Rey Valiente, the brave king. For a brief window in 1947 and 1948, it seemed to be working. The movement was growing. The rallies were getting bigger. The Carloctavista faction was no longer a joke, it was a force. But while he was conquering the mountains, he was losing his home. Every tragedy has a fracture point. For Karl Pius, it was right inside his own house. His marriage to Christa Satzguer de Balvanos had been the romantic gesture that defined his youth. But romance does not pay the bills, and romance does not survive the relentless grinding pressure of political ambition. By 1948, the marriage was dying. The problem was twofold. First, money. Being a pretender is an expensive hobby. You have to maintain appearances. You have to pay staff, fund propaganda, travel. Karl Pius had no vast inheritance left. They were living on donations and the selling of family heirlooms. The financial stress was suffocating. Second, and more cruelly, was the politics. Christa knew she was the problem. She knew that every time Karl walked into a room, the purist Carlist whispered, "That is the woman who disqualifies him. She is not royal. Her children cannot inherit." Imagine the psychological toll. To be the wife of a man who claims to be king, but to know that your very existence is the greatest obstacle to his success. She was the dark secret on display. The advisors, the fanatical men like Jesus de Cora, began to whisper in Karl's ear. They suggested that for the good of Spain, perhaps the king should be unburdened. They didn't suggest murder. They suggested annulment, separation. Karl Pius, caught between his ambition and his wife, began to pull away. He spent more time in the mountains, more time with his court. He left Christa alone in the drafty apartment in Barcelona to face the creditors and the critics. The love story that had defied the Habsburg laws was being strangled by the Habsburg ambition. By the end of 1948, Karl Pius stood at the summit. He had the titles. He had the brothers' renunciations. He had the tacit tolerance of Franco. He had the mountain army. He had built the perfect facade, a magnificent Potemkin village of royalty. But behind the facade, the rot was spreading. His pockets were empty. His marriage was crumbling. And in Madrid, General Franco was beginning to get bored with his toy. The throne of smoke was fully formed. Now all it would take was a stiff wind to blow it away. And the wind was coming. History is full of strange juxtapositions, but few are as jarring as this. The heir to the Holy Roman Empire, the claimant to the Catholic throne of Spain, finding his destiny in a dusty divorce court in Reno, Nevada. By 1949, the cracks in Karl Pius's life had become chasms. He had spent a decade building a political movement on the foundation of tradition and family. But now, to save his political ambition, he felt compelled to destroy his own family. The Prince of Nowhere was about to become the King of Solitude. In 1949, Christa Satzger de Balvanos packed her bags. She took the children. She left the drafty, tension-filled apartment in Barcelona and crossed the Atlantic. She didn't go to Vienna. She didn't go to Paris. She went to Reno. In the mid-20th century, Reno was the divorce capital of the world. It was a place of quick fixes for broken dreams. For a Habsburg Archduke to have his marriage dissolved, there was a humiliation of epic proportions. It was modern. It was vulgar. It was everything the Carlist movement despised. But here lies the twisted logic of Karl Pius's inner circle. His hardline advisors, men like Jesus de Cora, didn't mourn the divorce. They celebrated it. To them, Christa had always been the morganatic stain. She was the obstacle. They whispered to Karl that this was a necessary sacrifice. "Let her go," they said. "Now you are free. Now you can marry a real princess. Now you can produce a male heir who is pure of blood." They treated a tragedy like a tactical maneuver. On May 4th, 1950, the civil divorce was finalized. Karl Pius was single again, but he wasn't free. He was a Catholic king who had just used a civil court to end a sacrament. The hypocrisy was a stench that no amount of incense could cover. In the wreckage of this tactical maneuver stood two little girls, Alejandra and Immaculata. They were archduchesses of Austria. They were princesses of Tuscany. But to their father's movement, they were inconveniences. Because they were female, and because of their mother's rank, they were excluded from the succession. Karl Pius loved his daughters. By all accounts, he was a tender father when the weight of the crown wasn't crushing him, but he let them go. He allowed them to be taken to America, far away from the toxic atmosphere of his court. Silence descended on the apartment after they left. The king sat on his throne of smoke, surrounded by sycophants and medals, but his home was empty. He had sacrificed the warmth of a family for the cold comfort of a claim. He was 40 years old. He had no son. He had no wife. He had only the cause, and the cause was a hungry beast. To fill the void, Karl Pius threw himself into the performance of kingship with a manic energy. If he couldn't be a husband, he would be the most majestic king Spain had ever seen. Between 1949 and 1951, the shadow court went into overdrive. He began to act as if he were already reigning in Madrid. He didn't just grant titles, he reorganized the state on paper. He appointed ministers to departments that didn't exist. He drafted constitutions for a country that wasn't listening. He needed money badly. The divorce was expensive. The court was expensive. Critics accused him of selling knighthoods. For a donation to the cause, you too can be a knight of the lily. It was a monarchy for sale. But to Karl, it was survival. He was keeping the flame alive. He was building a network of obligation. Every man who wore his medal was a man who had a stake in his victory. If Karl failed, their titles became worthless paper. He was trapping them in his dream. But a civil divorce in Reno wasn't enough for a Catholic king. He needed the church. He needed an annulment. In 1951, Karl Pius launched his most desperate legal battle. He petitioned the Vatican to declare his marriage to Christa null and void from the beginning. His argument was technical and cold. He claimed that because he was an archduke, he was subject to the secret family laws of the Habsburgs. These laws required the head of the house to approve any marriage. Since his brother Leopold hadn't formally approved it, the marriage was invalid. It was a legal Hail Mary. He was asking the Pope to say, yes, you were married for 10 years, and yes, you have 2 children, but because of a secret dynastic rule from 1839, none of it counted. The Vatican stalled. The Church moves in centuries, not weeks. They looked at this king in Barcelona with suspicion. They didn't want to get involved in a Spanish succession war. The silence from Rome was deafening. Karl waited for a verdict that would never come. He remained a divorced man in a Catholic country, a fatal contradiction. While Karl was fighting for his spiritual legitimacy, his political legitimacy was eroding. General Franco had used Karl Pius perfectly. By 1951, the main monarchist threat, Don Juan, had been sufficiently weakened. The monarchist movement was split into 3 or 4 angry factions. Franco was secure. He no longer needed his counter-king. The support from the regime began to dry up. The police permits for rallies were delayed. The press coverage became thinner. The local governors, who had once bowed to Karl, now found they were too busy to meet him. Karl Pius felt the temperature drop. He realized with a creeping dread that he hadn't outsmarted the dictator. He had been played. He was a tool that had served its purpose, and tools that are no longer needed are usually discarded. By the end of 1951, the adrenaline was fading. The divorce hadn't brought a new marriage or a male heir. It had only brought loneliness. The titles hadn't brought power. They had only brought ridicule. Karl Pius was 42 years old. He was alone. He was broke. And he was beginning to feel tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from carrying a lie for too long. But he had one card left to play. One final desperate attempt to force the world to acknowledge him. If he couldn't conquer Madrid, he would conquer the hearts of the enemy. He would try to buy the dictator himself. There comes a moment in every tragedy where the hero, desperate to avoid his fate, runs directly into it. By 1952, Archduke Karl Pius was running out of time. His shadow court was bankrupt. His marriage was gone. The Vatican was silent. The world was moving on. He realized that he had only one card left to play. It was the most dangerous card in the deck. He decided to embrace the very man who was suffocating him. He decided to try and buy the loyalty of General Francisco Franco, not with money, for he had none, but with honor. It was intended to be a master stroke of diplomacy. Instead, it became his political suicide note. The logic was twisted but clear. Karl reasoned, Franco is the barrier to the throne. If I make Franco one of us, if I bind him to my dynasty with a sacred oath, he will be honor-bound to restore me. In 1952, Karl Pius issued a decree. He awarded General Franco the Grand Collar of the Order of Proscribed Legitimacy. Think about the name of that order, Proscribed Legitimacy. It was an order created for those who had suffered for the king, for those who were outlaws for the cause. By giving it to Franco, the man who was the jailer of the monarchy, the man who had hijacked the Carlist victory, Karl Pius turned the award into a joke. He sent the collar to the Pardo Palace. He waited for the embrace. He waited for Franco to say, "Thank you, Your Majesty. Let us rule together." Franco accepted the medal. He added it to his collection. And he did absolutely nothing. To Franco, it was just another trinket. But to Karl's followers, it was a betrayal of biblical proportions. The reaction from the Carlist base was instant and furious. These were men who had bled in the trenches fighting against the centralization of the state. They viewed Franco as a necessary evil or even a traitor to their ideals. For their king to bow down and honor the dictator was unforgivable. He has sold the birthright for a bowl of soup, they said. The Carloctavista movement began to hemorrhage support. The purists left, the idealists left. Even the opportunists began to leave, sensing that the ship was sinking. Karl Pius had hoped to gain the state by appeasing Franco. Instead, he lost the people. He was now a general without an army. He was shouting into a void. The isolation took a physical toll. Friends who saw Karl in 1953 described a man who was rapidly aging. He was only 43 years old, but he looked 60. His face was puffy. His eyes were bloodshot. The distinctive Habsburg jaw, once a symbol of strength, now seemed set in a permanent grimace of pain. He was suffering from high blood pressure. But the real sickness was existential. He had cut ties with his brothers. He had divorced his wife. He had sent his children away. He had alienated his followers. He was the king of Spain in his own mind, but in reality he was a lonely bachelor in a rented flat, waiting for a phone call from Madrid that would never come. The silence of 1953 was heavy. It was the silence before the storm. As the winter of 1953 approached, a strange mood settled over the exile circle. There was a sense of finality. Karl Pius continued his routine. He held small meetings. He signed papers. But the fire was gone. It was mechanical. He was a ghost haunting his own life. On December 4th, he celebrated his 44th birthday. It was a quiet affair. There were no parades, no grand speeches, just a few loyalists raising a glass to a dream that was already dead. Did he know? Did he feel the blood vessel in his brain weakening? Did he feel the ticking clock inside his own skull? We cannot know. But we do know that he spent those final weeks trying to put his affairs in order. Not political affairs. Those were a mess beyond repair, but his soul. He attended Mass frequently. He prayed with a fervor that unnerved his aides. He was preparing to meet the only king who actually outranked him. Christmas Eve, 1953. The city of Barcelona was alive with celebration. Families were gathering. Children were waiting for gifts. The churches were preparing for the midnight Mass. In the residence of the Archduke, the lights were on. But there would be no Christmas miracle for the house of Habsburg-Tuscany. The Prince of Nowhere had reached the end of his road. Death is the only absolute monarch. It does not care about titles, manifestos, or the divine right of kings. The timing was almost cruel in its irony. It was Christmas Eve, 1953. While the world sang of a Savior born in a manger, the man who would be King of Spain had just returned to his rented flat in Barcelona. Perhaps he was thinking of his daughters in America. Perhaps he was thinking of his estranged wife. We will never know. A sudden, catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage struck him down. It was quick. There were no final speeches. Just the sudden, brutal interruption of a life that was only half-lived. Archduke Karl Pius, Carlos VIII to his followers, a renegade to his family, was 44 years old. His heart was full of ambition, but his brain was flooding with blood. His brother, Archduke Franz Joseph, watched as the life drained from the youngest, the most vibrant, the most reckless of them all. This was the end of the Prince of Nowhere and the beginning of his silence. When the sun rose on Christmas Day, the news spread through the city. The king is dead. But there was no cry of "Long live the king." Wow. Because there was no one to take his place. Even in death, Karl Pius reached for a legitimacy he could never quite grasp in life. He was not buried in Vienna with his Habsburg ancestors. He was not buried in a simple parish plot. He was taken to the monastery of Poblet. This was sacred ground. It was the resting place of the medieval kings of Aragon. By being buried here, he was making his final argument to history. I belong with them. The funeral was a melancholy affair. The shadow court gathered one last time. The dukes and counts he had created stood by the grave, their medals clinking against their black mourning suits. But look at who was missing. General Franco did not attend. The official Spanish government sent low-level representatives. The Vatican sent no special envoy. To the powers of the world, this was not the funeral of a head of state. It was the burial of a nuisance. They lowered him into the stone floor. And with the closing of the tomb, the Carloctivista movement effectively died with him. The death of a dictator creates a vacuum. The death of a pretender creates a farce. Almost immediately, the movement Karl had built began to cannibalize itself. The fundamental flaw of his grand design was revealed. It was never a dynasty, it was a cult of personality. With the king gone, the spell was broken. Some followers returned to the main Carlist branch. Others joined Franco's party, but most simply went home, took down the portrait of Carlos VIII, and tried to forget they had ever believed in him. General Franco, sitting in his palace, likely didn't even smile. He simply turned the page. The problem had solved itself. To the cold eyes of political historians, Karl Pius is a ghost written in invisible ink. He failed to capture the throne. He failed to unite his people. In a cruel twist of irony, his rebellion achieved the exact opposite of what he intended. By dividing the traditionalist forces, he cleared the path for the liberal democracy he so despised. But to judge him only by his failures is to miss the haunting beauty of his existence. Archduke Karl Pius was a creature of tragic contradiction, a medieval knight suffocating in a world of tanks and telephones. He was a romantic, trying to play a game of cold pragmatism, and he paid the ultimate price. He had bartered his peace for conflict, sacrificed his marriage for a manifesto, and traded the warmth of his children's laughter for the cold, metallic taste of a crown that never existed. He lies now in the stone silence of the monastery of Poblet, resting among the ancient kings of Aragon. He is a ruler without a realm, a monarch of memory waiting for a judgment that is no longer in the hands of men. He was the prince of nowhere, and in the end, nowhere was the only kingdom vast enough to hold him.